You have written so eloquently about the nuanced and layered ways in which the processes of consciousness and cognition and communication are in fact layered as sub-processes and very subtle interactions with parts of the brain. In your explorations of brain injury, and particularly your observations at Rusk recently, and just your awareness of what's going on, because people are surviving brain injuries today who never survived those injuries even a decade ago. How does an understanding of brain injury help us to understand the interrelationships between the processes that make up speech, reading, sensation, cognition? Or are the injuries that we're dealing with in brain injuries so blunt that it's often very, very difficult to separate those kinds of things?
Paradoxically and rather cruelly, huge advances in insight and therapy especially come in wartime and with conflict and with the wounded. And Rusk's own blooding came in World War II, and his realization that there were thousands, hundreds of thousands of brain injured or otherwise injured soldiers who were just sitting around and not getting any sort of rehabilitation. Sometimes an injury, a brain injury, may be rather specific. For example, in the 1940s, there was a description of 3 German soldiers who, following a head injury, became unable to recognize the faces of their loved ones. They had no other problems. With one of these soldiers who was in hospital, if his wife dressed in a nurse's uniform, he could not distinguish her from the other nurses, nor the other nurses from each other, with one exception. There was one nurse he could always recognize. When he was asked how he recognized her, he said, by her shining white teeth. So here's an example of a very specific part of the brain which has been knocked out, and indeed it wasn't realized that one could acquire. Face blindness was first described as a result of a head injury, of a brain injury, of a highly specific sort. But other brain injuries, as you were saying, can be sort of diffuse and pervasive. It may even be difficult to say exactly what it is, but people who've had it are no longer themselves. And they recognize this, and their wives or husbands do. And similar injuries to some of the war injuries can be produced in combat sports like football and boxing, which are a hideously rich source of brain injury. The NFL and others have been denying this, but now it's sort of beginning to become apparent. So some of your insights and some of your therapies are very precisely localized. How is someone who can't recognize their wife or children, let alone anyone else, going to manage? But then how is someone who has, let us say, lost their initiative, lost their go, which can happen with frontal lobe involvement, to get going again?
Let's talk a little bit about the strains on healthcare that come from people's longevity, which then increases the incidence of dementia and Alzheimer's, et cetera. It seems that in healthcare, as we develop therapies that allow the body to live, we need to understand that often that survivability comes with deficits to the brain and cognition. It seems as though in medicine, all roads lead to better therapies for the brain or a better understanding of the brain, or having to live with the fact that we are creating more and more people surviving with less and less intellectual capacity, and that's a huge strain on our society. How do we deal with that?
Well, there is, when the brain picture, the clinical picture of Alzheimer's is fairly specific, although until 1976 or so, the term was reserved for a small number of people with a pre-senile dementia. Now, all the people, 95% of the people we call senile or demented, are thought to have Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is not an inevitable consequence of brain aging. Brain aging is inevitable, but its effects are relatively mild. One is somewhat slower, one forgets a bit, but there are still, Virgil Thomson, the composer, was still vitally active in composing at the age of 103. I work in various old age homes and I see lots of lively centenarians. There is, although Alzheimer's is commoner with age, there is an as yet undiscovered cause of Alzheimer's and of many other neurodegenerative diseases, or at least we are beginning to discover them now in relation to these new brain-injuring proteins called prions or prions. The damage starts, say, with Alzheimer's 20 or more years before there are any clinical symptoms. And if we could detect what is happening at the age of 50 and treat it, then nothing would go wrong at 70. And so I think one of the most urgent things medically and economically, as you say, is to have more research on the neurodegenerative diseases and fund them. There was a very powerful article in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal on Monday by Stan Prusner, who got a Nobel Prize for discovering prions, and he brings out that Alzheimer's is as common and fatal as cancer, but only gets 1/10 of the funding which cancer gets. I don't know whether this deals with what you're saying, but
no, certainly it does.
We need a war on Alzheimer's, and it's likely to be more successful in some ways than a war on cancer, because there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different forms of cancer, whereas Alzheimer's is Alzheimer's, seemingly.
What do you make of the federal projects, some of the private sector projects to map the brain, to get a better picture of the brain, to do baseline data on brain functioning, to create atlases of the brain? Do you think that's a viable and important avenue to deal with some of these other brain issues that we're going to be dealing with in rehab?
Yes, I think this is very exciting and important, and this is being funded. And the more we know about the brain, the more we can locate things, and especially the connections with some of our existing forms of visualizing the brain. You find the sort of the high points of activity, but you don't actually know the details of the circuitry or what's going on. And we need to know about the brain in far more detail, and I think we will.
As someone who has such a poetic, as Dr. Whiteson said, tenderness for patients and patient stories, and an innate sense of what they're saying is true. I may not be able to understand what the scientific basis is of what they're saying, but I'm listening to what they're saying. How do you respond to, and I've talked with many families of brain-injured veterans, who can go chapter and verse about the medical rehab and the drugs that they're taking and the various improvements that they may have made or not made. But it always comes down to the same question, and it's, he's not himself. She's not herself. She's lost that. Do you think science will be able to understand where this self is, because it's a very tangible thing for these families, where it goes in a brain injury, and if there's any way to, in fact, to get this self back?
There was a famous case in the 1840s of a railway foreman, a man called Phineas Gage, a very thoughtful, prudent man, whose job it was to insert dynamite and help build the railways. And this involved using a tamping iron to get the dynamite in place, and there was a mishap, and the dynamite exploded while the tamping iron was there, and it blew this iron rod straight through his head. He was knocked over, and he then got up, bleeding, and he walked into town, and actually said to the local doctor, "Here's business for you." He had the iron rod through his head.
Gets the doctor's attention when you do that.
Well, he had no intellectual deficits, and no sensory or motor deficits, but his friends said, Gage is no longer Gage. He is no longer himself. Some of this could, one aspect was that he'd become rather impulsive and impatient, where he'd been prudent and thoughtful before. But the ultimate questions are, what is the brain basis of individuality, of self, of identity, of consciousness, we know in crude ways that, say, damage, especially frontal lobe damage, is the most harmful to sense of self and initiative, but we need to find out more and to focus in on this. And there's a tremendous effort at the moment to try and define the neural. Long ago, I wrote an essay called "Neurology and the Soul." I'm no believer in anything immaterial or surviving death, but I think what is so wonderful is the way in which the totality of a man's mind and personality and wishes and hopes and experiences is embodied somehow in his brain or in the processes of his brain. And this is where the focus has to be.
What rehabilitative techniques and strategies, therapies that you may have observed recently, or just as recently as your visit to Rusk, really excite you in the sense that they're on to something here, and these are progresses and therapies that really show the way forward?
Well, there was actually something I saw last week which I'd never encountered before. One is used to visual disorders and visual rehab, and hearing and speech disorders and rehab, and rehab for, well, I think I'm going to tell a little story.
Oh, good.
There is a sense which is at least as important as the special senses, and this is called proprioception. It is proprioception which gives you the sense of one's own body, where one's limbs are, what one is doing, and so forth. So this is an invisible sense. It was once called the sixth sense. There's another invisible sense which comes from the part of the ears, the vestibules, and this is crucial for one's balance, and one's orientation in space. A friend and colleague of mine has studied and written about a remarkable, I don't know whether to say subject, friend, collaborator. They've worked together for many years. Ian, his subject, was 18 years old when he got a strange disease, well, like a sensory equivalent of Guillain-Barré disease. It was a disease which deprived him of sensation from the neck down, from the head down.
You still had mobility, but no sensation.
Yeah, and he had mobility, but his limbs flailed around a bit. There was no weakness, but he was as disabled and frustrated as if he were quadriplegic, probably more so for the first 6 months. He couldn't sit up. There was no sensory control. He couldn't speak too well because one needs sensation from the larynx and so forth. Through there's been a most amazing rehabilitation, and Ian is now able to lead a relatively normal life and even to drive a car, although he can't feel the controls of the car. And everything is done by vision and by a tremendous enhancement of vision and deliberation. For example, it's difficult for him, say, to stand and talk. He can stand or talk. Standing requires all his consciousness, so he will sit down or stand against something. He can pass for normal unless, or he could pass for normal unless the lights were to go out suddenly. And if they were to go out suddenly, he would end up as a toneless heap on the ground in 5 seconds.
It's because his visual sense is doing all the work of this proprioception.
Well, almost all the work. But there's this other sense which Rusk made me think of, which is his vestibular sense. If his vestibular sense could be heightened, I think it probably is somewhat heightened, Rusk might help him to heighten it more.
But you're saying there's some kind of radar vestibular sense in these odd shapes of the ear.
Yes.
And so the nerve endings and the capture of visual and physical energy is transformed into this sense of ourselves physically in space.
Yes.
Wow.
Very, very...
I'm going to tell my kids not to get any piercings.
The astronauts, when they find themselves in zero gravity, or sometimes divers, can lose their sense of up and down. They have to be, and when astronauts come back, they have to readapt with their proprioception and their vestibules. But Ian is one of a kind. This is a very rare condition. I have a lot of patients with Parkinson's disease, and Parkinson's can affect sensation as well, and in particular it affects some of the brain connections of proprioception and vestibular, so that eyesight is very important. A Parkinsonian patient does well to hold on to something if he's going to sneeze. Because in the act of sneezing, the eyes close, you can't keep, and like Ian, they may fall over if they sneeze. But they have poor vestibular function. I wonder how Parkinsonian patients would do with the new Rusk thing for vestibular rehabilitation.
Describe the vestibular rehabilitation protocols that you observed at Rusk.
I can't.
You can't.
I mean, I will have to come back and have a proper visit. But I just thought vestibular rehabilitation, I never heard of this. What a great idea. Everyone ignores the vestibules.
But you saw at Rusk some attempt to use that as a platform for
yes,
brain rehabilitation.
I think it was very an exciting innovation, and I would love to learn more. I'm sorry I can't say more.
Well, no, I'm glad to hear about it.
Yeah.
I mean, as someone who has sensation only from here up, I had no idea how much trouble I was in. But there are burn scars all over my lap that come from the fact that if you don't have sensation, it is a huge disability all by itself. Forget the mobility problems. And you know, these are the kinds of things that I encountered in my rehabilitation at Rusk and in other facilities around the United States. All right, I want to end a last question from me and then get questions from the audience here. Because I know you're all very busy people. This is one auditorium where we don't say turn off your pagers and your cell phones, because we know that there are probably life and death matters that are going on with all of you. But let me just say, in general, do you believe that brain injury in this century will be an increasingly frustrating set of conditions for people who survive them? Or will we develop the kinds of rehabilitation technologies and techniques that gave hope to people who 100 years ago, coming out of the Great War in Europe, who had virtually no hope if they were spinal cord injured. 100 years later, those injuries have all kinds of rehabilitative technologies. Do you think this same narrative will be the case in the 21st century?
Well, there's huge tragedy in the immediate future, but there are, I don't know, tens or hundreds of thousands of brain-injured people who will only get to a certain level. Looking further ahead, with further knowledge, there are all sorts of imaginable and unimaginable technologies, including the use of stem cells, of deep brain stimulation. We are going to know. 30 years ago, it used to be said that any injury to the nervous system is permanent. There's no regeneration. We now know that this is not the case. There can be a good deal of regeneration. There can be a huge amount of recircuiting, which is largely what rehabilitation is about. But we also know that new nerve cells are produced in certain parts of the brain. We know that one can implant stem cells into certain parts of the brain. This has been done with Parkinson's. So I think beyond the grim immediate future, I think it gets much brighter, and the global brain mapping and anything is going to be crucial. We need huge resources to be poured into this.
Well, Oliver, as always, it's a delight to be with you, and I will stop monopolizing your time. If you have questions, please raise your hands. We have microphones that will come to you. If there is no immediate question, I always have another, because that's my gig. Anything? Right here in the front, third row.
From your knowledge of the brain and your experience with brain injury, do you tend to be optimistic or pessimistic about the utility of cryonics?
Are you optimistic or pessimistic about cryonics, if that's what you asked, in terms of brain preservation, that sort of thing?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by cryonics. There are various procedures in which one may artificially lower the body temperature for a few hours, say while one does a heart transplant. You want to reduce the brain's need for oxygen. Or did you mean being put away?
You're doing the liquid nitrogen thing?
After clinical death.
After clinical death.
Like Alcor or CryoCare.
Would you go for something like that?
As a for what?
After clinical death, doing the whole liquid nitrogen, super freeze body, and then thaw it out when things get a little more optimistic about the brain research? It's basically what you're saying, right? Yeah.
I've no special thoughts. I think it's a nice subject for science fiction. I wouldn't want to be preserved myself. And I,
Awakenings 2?
Sorry?
Awakenings 2?
The
sequel?
Yeah.
All right. Other questions? We got one right over here. Can you reconcile the idea of infectious agents of cognitive decline in prions with the acceleration of decline with aging, sensory deprivation in aging?
Well, there's a dynamic situation. People with mild brain damage may, who are lucid in the daytime, may have sundowning, so-called, when they get somewhat confused or disoriented. At night, when there are fewer sensory cues, fewer social cues, less for their brain to work with. And if one especially if the brain is not functioning too well, it needs the richest possible sensory and social environment. And if it's not there, then it doesn't function so well. But there's no contradiction between the need for environmental richness and a brain process.
Would you say that rich sensory stimulation is a kind of an antibody, an immune reaction to prions, infectious cognitive decline, or is it something much more complicated than that?
Well, it's there was the so-called nun study, when it was found that some highly literate nuns were less apt to get Alzheimer's or got it at a later age than some less literate nuns, whether their literacy, in fact, whether this correlation meant anything. There's a lot of talk now about cognitive exercises, and cognitive gym and cognitive remediation is very important. It'll certainly keep you going as long as you can keep going, but there is no sure, even the most intelligent people can become demented, though sometimes in rather charming ways. So that, for example, when Emerson developed Alzheimer's, or what sounds like Alzheimer's, people would ask him how he was, and he would say, "I've lost all my intellectual powers, but I'm perfectly well. Thank you." And
I'll try and remember that line if I have to deal with dementia.
I think an important thing, besides talking about process and enrichment, is to have less stigma and less shame and less sadness associated with dementia.
And brain injuries of all kinds.
And brain injuries of all kinds, yeah.
Other questions? We're on this side in the back.
I had occasion to ask Robin Williams what his favorite movie was, and he said it was Awakenings because he got to meet you.
That's nice. Robin Williams told her that his favorite movie was Awakenings because he got to meet you.
Well, I very much enjoyed meeting him, and although it was rather disconcerting at one point because we'd been seeing each other for 2 or 3 weeks, and we were chatting in the street, and I was in what I gather is a habitual pose, and I realized he was in the same pose, and that quite unconsciously he had adopted and incorporated all of my so-called mannerisms and postures. Then we had to make a little distance between us, but
yeah, that would freak me out, I think. If De Niro starts doing that, then I'm really going crazy. Other questions? Well, I've got one, and we've got just a few minutes before we consider. We've got plenty of time for a few more questions. You alluded to this before, the recircuiting of the brain, the physiological processes that cause the brain to recircuit functions from a place that is damaged to a place that is undamaged. What do we know about that, and how confident are you that the brain's ability to adapt on its own may lead us to a lot of therapies?
Well, we can see this and study it in very simple nervous systems. our understanding of memory and learning is partly based on wonderful studies done here in New York by Eric Kandel on Aplysia, which is a giant sea snail. And Aplysia only has 20,000 neurons, where we have 100 billion. But you can train an Aplysia. An Aplysia can habituate to some stimuli. It can learn things, and you can actually measure and see how the recircuiting going on. The anatomical circuitry is the same, but the synapses change. And you can find some of the, it's much more difficult to visualize this in the brain because you have this enormous thicket of neurons, but there is tremendous flexibility in neural structures. And there's the synapse, this wonderful junction where nerve fibers meet, and some nerve cells have 1,000 or 10,000 synapses. But in a way, we are our synapses, and these are both constant, so that we are the same individual, but also modifiable in all sorts of ways to an amazing degree. So we're not running into, but there are clearly limits. The limits become stronger with age, but even in adults there can be rather remarkable things. The damage to the left hemisphere, the language areas of the brain, can make someone aphasic and unable to express themselves in language. People who are aphasic can nonetheless sing. And when they sing, they may sing the words of a song. And this can be very reassuring because it shows them that language is there somewhere, even if it's embedded in the song. There is a therapy called melodic intonation therapy. It is a very intensive therapy which requires dozens of hours with a therapist. But through this, and using music as a bridge, fairly good language can be reacquired, but this good language is now located in the right and embodied in the right hemisphere of the brain, which normally has no language capacity. One wouldn't have thought that such a transfer could occur in an adult, but it can. And I find this one of the most amazing examples of reallocation.
There seems to be
brain area taking it. Yeah.
There seems to be a collision between information theory and computer science and neuroscience on some level. Do you think it will ever be the case that we will be able to specify the kinds of data structures and information structures that constitute thought and memory and communication in our brains and recognize them in our brains in the same way that we can recognize data sets in a digital realm?
Well, I'm not sure that we would want to do this, even if we could do it. But say specifically, memory, biological memory, is totally different in quality from computer memory. For better or worse, our memories are flexible. They depend on construction and reconstruction. They have fallibilities in various ways, but they have astonishing powers of association. The computer or AI model breaks down, although it is it's a sort of vital complement to neuroscience. I mean, in terms of speed, computers can do, I don't know, billions or trillions of operations a second. We do whatever, 5 or 6 operations a second. I think there will be, and there's already beginning to be, an important interface between the human nervous system and computers. And I don't know, one doesn't know how far this will go, whether one will have computer chips embedded in the brain or nerve nets embedded in computers. But it's these two are complementary, yet extremely different.
I can imagine very fashionable looking USB ports on my vestibula here at some point. A last question, and then we'll, right over here. You can stand, there we go.
Yeah, incidentally, I'm sorry, you're saying this one should say that, you know, examples of sort of electronic prostheses are of course the cochlear prosthesis, and now small artificial retinas are being made.
Indeed.
So you, in your work, you've described a lot about how the mind is able to accommodate injury and how it's able to adapt to circumstances. To what extent have you found, or do you think that we have the power to deliberately make those changes, to deliberately change the way we think, to the level that you found in reaction to injury?
I wonder if I've got a phrase here that was very fluent, and I think it was English, but I didn't catch a single word.
That's fine, that's fine. They're asking if in the same way in which we can recircuit the brain and change its function and form for people who are injured, can we do this on our own if we're not injured to create enhancements or changes in our own thinking, cognition, the way our brain functions?
Well, this is what education is about, what all learning is about, probably what psychoanalysis is about. I wasn't sure whether you had in mind sort of cognitive exercises, sort of computer games or drugs or what.
You've tried them all, I know.
But certainly an accent is shifting in medicine from not just treating disease and deficiency, but enhancing. And this is going to raise all sorts of intriguing ethical as well as other problems.
Certainly a subject for a whole other lunchtime here at the Farkas Auditorium. I want to thank Dr. Sachs and NYU for such a lovely presentation.
Thank you.